Hello, and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California, our new name after merging with World Affairs near the end of last year. I'm Eric Siegel. I'm chair of the club's Personal Growth Forum and your host for today. We also welcome our listening audience, and we invite everybody to visit us online at commonwealthclub.org. A few years ago, the club hosted a series of talks about false narratives, which have been with us for a long time. As the famous satirist Jonathan Swift said in 1710, and I quote, "Falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it, so that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late. The jest is over and the tale hath had its effect." The danger is that false beliefs and their cousins, conspiracy theories, can damage the shared fact base on which democracy depends. There can be a loss of trust in institution, tribalism and a search for an authoritarian leader in confusing times, increased stress levels and anger in society, and resulting legitimization of violence. It's therefore important to look at how these false beliefs can exert so much psychological power over us and what we can do about it. Dr. Joe Pierre led off our series of talks a few years ago. His talk was so successful that we've asked him to return at this pivotal time for a deeper look into the personal and societal effects of mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. Equally important, he's going to outline how we can avoid the pitfalls of acting on false beliefs, both as individuals and as a society. Besides being a great speaker, Dr. Pierre is one of the world's experts on the topics of delusion and false beliefs. He's a unit chief and health sciences clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UCSF. He's the author of over 100 scientific papers, and he has a newly published book by Oxford University Press called False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True. He also writes the Psych Unseen column for Psychology Today, is the recipient of various awards, and is an expert witness and consultant in legal cases involving delusion-like beliefs and conspiracy theories. So it's now my pleasure to ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Pierre to the club and to our podium.
All right, thank you, and thanks for coming out. It's been a couple of years since I was here last, as was mentioned. I tried to do my best to pack the audience with my friends and family and my book agents, so thanks for you guys coming. But I do see a few unfamiliar faces, so to those of you not related to me, thanks for joining us tonight. Okay, so my name is Joe Pierre. I'm a psychiatrist, and my clinical work through the years has focused on the treatment of people with psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. But my academic work has really focused on not so much mental illness as the gray area between psychopathology and normality. And in today's world, I would argue that there's no more timely and relevant example of this than believing things that aren't true. Now, last time I was here, I mostly talked about conspiracy theories. Tonight, I'm going to be talking more about false beliefs in a more general and broad sense. Now, we all believe things that aren't true, whether it's self-deception aimed at avoiding distress, like when I tell myself how great I look in the mirror, false memories, contradictory religious ideas about what happens when we die, or just getting the facts wrong from time to time. So I think everyone would agree that only the most arrogant among us would ever claim that we're never wrong and we're always right. We probably know people that say that, but... and I think we should also acknowledge at the start that there are many areas of inquiry where the facts are elusive or unknown and legitimately debatable. But none of that is what I'm going to be focusing on tonight. My focus instead will be on what some people call alternative facts, which are false beliefs despite the truth being known with reasonable certitude. My focus is also on beliefs that I think matter because of their negative consequences. Now, more than 10 years ago, I used to direct a lecture series at the hospital where I worked down in Los Angeles, and I invited a computer scientist from Caltech to come give a talk. And I remember being sort of taken aback when he made this offhand comment that the greatest threat to humanity is personal dogma. That seemed kind of like hyperbole to me, and it also seemed a bit out of his lane as a computer scientist to say so. But I must say now, more than a decade later, that it's hard to disagree with him now, because personal dogma, which I would define as false beliefs held with strong conviction despite evidence to the contrary, have become eminently consequential in the world today. I would even go so far as to say that due to the politicization of false beliefs about existential issues like healthcare and climate change, it's gotten to the point that we're risking suicide by false belief. My agent doesn't like that phrase, but I like it. I'm going to keep using it. Now, you may think that suicide by false belief is hyperbole, but I'm going to try to convince you otherwise, starting with a couple examples. So let's start with vaccines and the false belief about vaccines that will not go away. According to, and I should say as a housekeeping issue that I understand some people will only be listening through audio, and there will be some other people who might be later looking at video, and I don't know how well they'll see the slides. So there may be times when I end up narrating the slides, so pardon to you all for doing that. So, according to a 2024 Gallup poll, a majority of U.S. adults remain either unconvinced or uncertain about what scientists and doctors have been telling people for decades, that vaccines do not cause autism. A full 13 believe that vaccines do cause autism, while a whopping 51% are not sure. 25% believe that the conspiracy theory that scientists and the government know that vaccines cause autism, but are mandating them for our kids anyway. Over the past 2 decades, the number of U.S. adults who believe that vaccines are more dangerous than the diseases that they're designed to prevent has grown from about 7% just 5-10 years ago to as many as 20% now, which of course is 1 out of every 5 people. This kind of vaccine hesitancy has important health consequences, not just for individuals, but for communities and societies. This year, for example, vaccination rates for the flu are at the lowest that they've been since 2019. Meanwhile, we're now in the midst of, you may have heard, the worst flu season that we've had in 15 years. And even though flu season isn't over yet, we've already eclipsed the highest weekly number of flu deaths since at least 2020, with some 900 Californians, including 15 children that have died from the flu this season so far. Coincidentally, the rate of patients who think that it is important to vaccinate their kids, I said patients, that's a Freudian slip from my clinical work. The rate of parents who think that it's important to vaccinate their kids has dipped to its lowest point in the past 25 years. And actual childhood vaccinations have been on the decline in recent years, and they have now dipped well below the federal target of 95% that has been shown to reduce outbreaks of infectious disease. Meanwhile, you may have heard that right now in Texas, New Mexico, and several other states in the country, there's a small but growing outbreak of measles, a disease that was eliminated from the U.S. in 2000, but has since returned from year to year within these localized epidemics that have been attributed to vaccine hesitancy, that is, people not getting their kids vaccinated. If we look at just this flu season to date, 2 people, 1 adult and 1 child, infected with measles have died. And while you might have heard a certain person that I'll refer to later with an acronym for a name, RFK Jr., both of those people who died, the adult and the child, were both unvaccinated, contrary to what you might have heard about other causes. Now, if vaccine hesitancy continues to rise and vaccination rates continue to fall, as they likely are to do with RFK Jr. as the head of DHHS, the next global pandemic, which could be kind of any moment, could very well make COVID-19 look like a walk in the park. I don't know if people saw this headline about this unknown disease in the Congo that is Ebola-like. All right, so that's a little bit about vaccines. I'm going to pivot a little bit now and talk a bit about climate change. And I'm going to specifically look at the belief in global warming, or more specifically, anthropogenic climate change. Although the number of U.S. adults who believe that global warming is caused by human activity has been rising somewhat over the past couple decades, there's still a substantial minority who believe that global warming isn't caused by human beings. Around 30% of people responding to polls say that, as well as the conspiracy theory that it's an outright hoax, right? It's just been made up. That's about 15% in polls. This belief endures despite the fact that the past 12 years have been the hottest years ever recorded. And last year, 2024, was the hottest year ever, or yet, during recorded years. Now, like vaccine hesitancy, unbridled climate change can have deadly consequences, as we recently saw down in Los Angeles, where I used to live for 30-some years, and where unprecedented devastation was ushered in by a lethal combination of dry conditions and Santa Anas that were blowing up to 100 miles per hour. As one of my friends who lives in Los Angeles and lost their homes to the fires put it, "We are resilient. We will rebuild and continue to destroy the earth." So indeed, if we look at recent poll results, this poll found that depending on the age demographic, as many as 50% of respondents don't believe that the wildfires in LA had anything to do with climate change. And I have a lot of gray hair. I see some gray hair in the audience. You can see that that belief was actually higher among older people. You know, sometimes we like to blame things on young people, but we have to take responsibility as well. Okay, and finally, while we're on the subject of disasters, let's talk about politics. So there's good evidence that the 2024 presidential election was decided based on false beliefs. Beliefs about the rates of violent crime, the rates of illegal immigration, the rates of inflation, and the overall state of the economy. Consequently, we now have a president who seems intent on ushering in a new and unprecedented era of authoritarianism, oligarchy, and kakistocracy. Does anybody know what kakistocracy means? Excellent summary. Right, it means getting people in government who are completely incompetent. And so we now have cabinet picks who have openly denounced scientific consensus about vaccines, about responses to COVID-19, like masking or lockdowns, or, for that matter, the impact of fossil fuel production on global warming. So that I think it's fair to say that we can expect significant setbacks in healthcare, as well as climate policy in the US going forward. All right, so this is San Francisco, but even so, it's possible, and probably even likely, that some of you are thinking that what I'm saying so far might sound like a lot of leftist histrionics. And it's certainly true that here in the Bay Area, and especially up in Marin County where I live, that people have been no stranger to vaccine hesitancy. So maybe it is that you disagree with the facts as I've tried to present them thus far. Or maybe you're going to accuse me of being politically biased or ideologically biased. So I want to make clear that, number one, I'm not a political scientist. I'm a psychiatrist. And my initial interest in false beliefs and conspiracy theories really had nothing to do with politics when I first got into this area. In fact, probably more than anything, I was fascinated by flat earth beliefs, which are relatively apolitical. But since that time, over the past 6-7 years, false beliefs have really become politicized, right? I'm also particularly concerned that the politicization of anti-science beliefs that run counter to scientific consensus, especially now that MAGA Republicans are in power, is going to get a lot of people killed, right? That's why I call it suicide by false belief. False beliefs have potentially lethal consequences. And so with that stage set, we can now move on to the question of why we believe things that aren't true and why we hold on to beliefs with such tenacity despite counter-evidence or counter-opinions to the contrary. In my career as a psychiatrist, I've worked pretty much every day talking with patients who have delusions. Delusions are false beliefs held with unassailable conviction, like believing that you're the second coming of Christ, or that the FBI has implanted a tracking device in your brain. Now, psychiatry as a field through the years has spent a lot of time trying to figure out why people with psychotic disorders like schizophrenia have delusions, what makes them have delusional belief and what makes them hold on to them so tightly. One theory that matches my own clinical experience is that delusional patients often over-rely on what I call faith in subjectivity, meaning faith in their own subjective internal experience. So, for example, someone with schizophrenia who believes that they are the second coming of Christ or that there's a radio transmitter implanted in their brain do that because maybe they hear a voice telling them, right? I'm hearing God telling me that I'm the second coming of Christ. And to me, if I'm hearing that voice, that sounds real, right? It sounds just as real as your voice or my voice. And so it can become all but impossible for people to conclude otherwise when they have those experiences. Now, what's funny is that since psychiatrists focus on mental illness and focus on psychopathology, we tend to avoid asking ourselves why it is that normal people without mental illness also hold false beliefs, and why they also defend them with a conviction that is overwarranted based on the belief. Now, one question people always ask me is, what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist? Now, one difference, aside from psychiatrists go to medical school and can prescribe medications, is that psychologists aren't restricted to the study of mental illness, right? There are psychologists that just study vision, for example. But despite the fact that psychologists don't restrict themselves to mental illness, it turns out that the question of why normal people cling to false beliefs has been historically neglected in psychology as well. And so a few years ago, I decided I needed to write a book that unravels the mystery of false belief, and as mentioned, happy to say, was just published and officially released this week. Now, I don't know who caught the event last Tuesday, but I was pleased to see that members of Congress seemed to be promoting my book. Whether inadvertently or not, during the president's address to the joint session, although I hope that more of them actually read it so that they're better equipped to respond to the challenge of false belief being used to justify bad public policy. Now, one thing that I make clear in the book, and that I want to make clear here, is that we don't believe in things that aren't true because we're all delusional. Despite what's often claimed, it's not true that our false beliefs or the beliefs of our ideological opposites are explained by people being mentally ill or brainwashed or stupid. We're not suffering from mass delusion or mass psychosis. The solution to this problem is not to come into my office and lie down on the couch or have me prescribe you a medication. So I can assure you as a psychiatrist, that's not what's going on here. Instead, if we think about things on an individual level, there are a multitude of cognitive processes that can explain our vulnerability to false belief, our shared vulnerability to false belief. And the vast majority of them are 100% normal in the sense that we all have them or utilize them to some degree, albeit in varying degrees. So in my book, I take the reader through a number of these different psychological phenomenon, including cognitive biases, heuristics, logical fallacies, and also more specific examples like confirmation bias or the illusory truth effect or the Dunning-Kruger effect. So if you've ever wondered what those terms mean, buy my book. And yeah, there's even one called bullshit receptivity. There's a whole chapter on bullshit receptivity. So I think those concepts can really help us understand why people believe things that aren't true and why we hold on to them. On the other hand, while I think all of that is relevant, I also argue for a more simple, more universal, less pathological, and more humanizing framework to understand false belief. Sometimes I call this the 3M model. I'll have to think about that one. I think it's trademarked by someone else. But the 3 M's are mistrust, kind of epitomized by this idea of I'm just asking questions, right? Misinformation, I'm looking for answers. And number 3, motivated reasoning, one of my most hated terms. I'm doing my own research. So let me try to sell you on this model by starting with mistrust. When I talk about mistrust, I'm talking about something called epistemic mistrust, which means mistrust of information, and more specifically, mistrust of, I'm going to call them mainstream sources of information, including institutions of authority and scientific expertise. In his 2016 commencement address at Caltech, the surgeon and author Atul Gawande made clear that when it comes to mistrust of scientific expertise, it's not that people mistrust science as a means to discern truth. Instead, what they mistrust are scientists. So again, if we look at some polls over the past several years, this is a Pew poll that's been given repeatedly over a 7-year period. While it's true that most people do trust scientists, at least a fair amount, the proportion of respondents that have a great deal of confidence in scientists has fallen to only about a quarter of the US population since the start of the pandemic. Meanwhile, another quarter of the US population says that they have not too much or no confidence at all that scientists act in the best interest of the public. If we drill down at 2019 and look at that same poll's results in 2019, when confidence in scientists was actually higher than it is now, 44% of respondents said that scientists are just as biased as everyone else, and 35% believed that the scientific method can be used to produce any conclusion the researcher wants. Presumably, as a result, about half of the US population in 2024 believe that scientists should stay out of policy debates, even about scientific issues. So why is it that we become so mistrustful? I'm always conscious about not falling into the trap of blaming everything on the internet. And yet, the fact is that in the internet era, we all have access to an unprecedented amount of information at our fingertips through what I like to call our peripheral brains. And we have the ability to post our thoughts and opinions online right alongside those of the Washington Post and the New York Times. In that sense, Elon Musk has a point, although I don't think it's an accurate one, but he has a point when he claims that the people are the media, that now the people are the media. This is where I'm going to have to read some slides for the people who will only be listening by audio, but have a number of these cartoons. So this often gives us an exaggerated impression of and a sense of confidence in what we know. So in this cartoon, a man at his computer says, "Honey, come look. I found some information all the world's top scientists and doctors have missed." This access to our peripheral brains also gives us an exaggerated impression of what other people know, especially those people who we do trust. So in this cartoon, similar to the previous one, there's another man sitting at his computer and he also says, "Honey, come quick." But he says, "This guy in the comment section just solved the Middle East crisis." With op-ed journalism, blogs, Substacks, YouTube channels, TikTok feeds, influencers like this guy who says, "I know nothing about the subject, but I'm happy to give you my expert opinion," have come to replace real expertise. Notice, by the way, that it's always men that are being depicted in these ridiculous, that are being ridiculous in these cartoons. I think they might be onto something there. So when we pay attention to influencers at the expense of listening to experts, and when we conclude that expertise is all but dead, we do so at our peril. So this cartoon, I'm narrating again for the people who can't see it, I think it's gone around in the past couple of years. There's a airplane, and a guy stands up in the plane, presumably when it's in the air flying, and he says, "These smug pilots have lost touch with regular passengers like us. Who thinks I should fly the plane?" And then half of the passengers raise their hand. Now, I'm certainly not claiming that we should all just blindly follow what we're told. And there's no doubt that sometimes mistrust is earned. I'm not saying to always follow authority, to follow party line, to follow institutions of authority. Sometimes that's not the right thing to do. But what I am claiming is that real expertise ought to count for something, and that when we reject expertise, it often amounts to blanket denialism rather than evidence-based skepticism. Although it's sometimes claimed that it's stupidity or anti-intellectualism or idiocracy that underlies that denialism, I think that conceptualization is off the mark. When we discount objective journalism, government agencies like the CDC, or scientists, it's not because we're stupid. Instead, as I've said, we tend to turn our backs on the truth when we no longer trust traditional institutions of epistemic authority. But by itself, mistrust doesn't explain why we believe falsehoods. Where do we get the alternative narratives? And so to understand that, we need to acknowledge that when we're mistrustful of sources of epistemic authority, we become vulnerable to the second M of my model, which is misinformation. I think, as Eric mentioned, misinformation is certainly not a new phenomenon. Misinformation I would define as false information. It's been around probably since the dawn of civilization, probably since human communication first began. And so if we swapped out smallpox in this cartoon for COVID-19 or measles, this political cartoon might seem like it's referring to events of the present day, even though it's from over a century ago. Researchers at RAND have coined this term truth decay. Didn't dawn on me until recently that was a play on words of tooth decay. But truth decay, defined by the RAND researchers, includes mistrust of informational sources, what I've just been talking about, the blurring of opinion and fact, and disagreement over what's true. And what they notice, going back in time several hundred years, is that truth decay tends to occur in the wake of new forms of media. So this happened when newspapers came out and the printing press, and it happened after radio, it happened after TV, and now, of course, we're in this new era. So over the past 50 years, coincident with the expansion of cable TV and the internet boom, our media landscape has transformed such that we have myriad sources of information accessible at the click of a button, with unreliable sources of information situated right alongside reliable ones, so that it's often difficult and sometimes even impossible to tell the difference. Indeed, then, it's far too easy to find misinformation that's presented as fact, supporting the very same kinds of false beliefs that I started the lecture talking about, such as the claim that vaccines are unsafe or ineffective, that the measles outbreak in Texas is actually caused by getting the measles vaccine, not by being unvaccinated, that new evidence does indeed support that vaccines cause autism, and that research studies provide proof of this, despite the fact that those studies were either retracted or published in fake journals designed to look like the real thing. In much the same way, there are many sources of information telling us that global warming is a hoax, including US senators and other self-appointed experts, including the occasional Nobel Prize winner, who stand against scientific consensus about climate change and allow people to reassure themselves that there's no reason to be alarmed. And that, of course, is just the tip of the misinformation iceberg. With just a little bit more digging, you can find even more outrageous claims, like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump apparently did, that immigrants were eating pets in Ohio. Note, by the way, that this YouTube video has amassed over 4.5 million views. You can also find evidence, quote unquote, evidence that the earth is flat. This video was actually removed from YouTube some years ago, but got nearly 1 million views, the 200 proofs that earth is not a spinning ball. And of course, the list goes on, right? You can find sources of information that say that indeed lizard people have infiltrated the government. I'm guessing some of you may actually start to believe that more in the coming years. That UFOs are regularly zooming around the planet and occasionally abducting people. that it's Jewish space lasers, not climate change, that's responsible for wildfires, and so on. No matter how outlandish the topic, we can always find someone out there claiming something to be true. Meanwhile, information scientists have found that within this click-based economy of the internet, misinformation or fake or false news travels farther and faster than reliable news. Sadly, the fact is that false information is much better at capturing our attention than the truth. This is both because false information is often titillating and because it's so good at making us angry and drawing us in to argue. So I have to admit, this cartoon kind of depicts me sometimes. As a man, I guess it's a man sitting at his computer, and his partner says, "Are you coming to bed?" The man says, "I can't, this is important." Partner says, "What?" And he says, someone is wrong on the internet. And then he's like, clacking away. Definitely done that at 1 a.m. in the morning. Thanks also to something called the illusory truth effect, which I discuss in the book, the more we're exposed to false information or misinformation, the easier it is to believe that it's either true or that it might be true, which is half the battle when you're trying to sell people on misinformation. This cartoon sums that up pretty well. So this guy at a restaurant or a coffee house talking, and he says, well, this is only a conspiracy theory now, but with the right marketing, it could become a widely held belief. That's the illusory truth effect, right? The idea that the more you hear something, the more you're going to believe it's true, even when it seems outrageous. And speaking of battles, suffice it to say that as Alex Jones or Jesse Waters suggest, there is indeed a war on information. This is how Jesse Waters described it in a recent tweet, or actually this was on Fox News that got amplified in a tweet. So he says, it's like grassroots guerrilla warfare. Someone says something on social media, Elon Musk, of course, retweets it, Joe Rogan podcasts it, Fox broadcasts it, and by the time it reaches everyone, millions of people have seen it. The information war is being waged within what I call the disinformation food chain, in which there are these apex predators that create and distribute disinformation, that is deliberate misinformation, that includes lies and propaganda. They distribute that downward into the food chain, gets picked up by mesopredators who both digest the information but then also repropagate it. And then finally, it trickles down to the bottom of the food chain where most of us live, and where we're the passive consumers of all that misinformation. Looking ahead, it's likely that disinformation will gain a larger foothold in capturing the attention of consumers, thanks to, for example, billionaire newspaper owners who have blocked political endorsements and have taken steps to restrict the content of op-ed pieces, and social media sites that have increasingly moved towards making profit-based decisions to abandon fact-checking while financially incentivizing viral content. Right now, the apex predators are winning the war on information, while the consumers, that is, we as a society, are losing. So it is that we now live in a post-truth world where everything is disputed, shared facts have been replaced by a tale of two alternate realities. Everyone thinks that they're the ones that have it right, and false beliefs are determining the fate of the world. All right, thus far, I've argued that false beliefs are caused by mistrust of reliable sources of information, and that caused by mistrust of reliable sources of information and misplaced trust in unreliable sources of information. But why is it that we hold on to these beliefs so tightly? To understand that, we need to look at the third M in my model, which is motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning goes hand in hand with a related cognitive process called confirmation bias. This is the best illustration of confirmation bias I've ever seen, so I'm going to read this one. This is a 3-panel cartoon. First panel is a guy, see, again, it's always a guy. Guy sitting at his computer, he says, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. Time to do my own research on the truth. And he gets on a search engine and he sees literally the first link that agrees with what you already believe. And he says, jackpot. Right? So confirmation bias means that we all tend to gravitate towards information that supports what we believe or want to believe, while swiping past or rejecting information that contradicts it. But motivated reasoning is something a little bit more involved. While confirmation bias refers to what we do when we encounter information, sort of looking at it or passing it by, motivated reasoning refers to what we do when we appraise or digest that information, which is typically to judge the information as very high quality when it supports what we believe, based on our ideological affiliations, or to dismiss the information as low quality junk when our beliefs are challenged or contradicted. This is what the Bible says about motivated reasoning. This is from Timothy. "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables." So, motivated reasoning explains why conservatives think that Fox News is great, but CNN is fake news, while liberals think the opposite. It also explains why some people can hold strong beliefs based on the flimsiest evidence or even one lone dissenting opinion. Here's another good illustration of motivated reasoning. There's a guy up at a lectern, just like me right now, and he says, "If P is false, I will be sad. I do not wish to be sad. Therefore, P is true." All right, so that's motivated reasoning. So when we engage in that kind of self-deception, we never have to admit that we're wrong. Feels pretty good, right? Here's another good illustration of motivated reasoning. This is another cartoon. Some friends are having a discussion over dinner, and one of them says, "That's strange. I remember it differently in a way that aligns with my worldview and casts me in a positive light." Right? So the motivated reasoning can also refer to past events and the way we process memory. This kind of rationalizing, reduces the unpleasantness of cognitive dissonance, which is the psychological tension that arises when our beliefs butt up against reality, and allows ourselves to preserve our ideological identities so that in the end we can feel good about ourselves with a sense of imperviousness to any challenges to our worldviews. Now, to be clear, we all engage in confirmation bias. We all engage in motivated reasoning, at least to some extent. If we were all free thinkers who objectively look at the evidence to decide what we believe, then we wouldn't be able to predict someone's beliefs, whether it's about vaccines or climate change or any other hot-button issue of the day, based on their political affiliation. And the fact that we often can do that means that many of us, most of us, engage in motivated reasoning that amounts to ideological groupthink. So, for example, although it has not always been the case, belief that vaccines cause autism is much more common among Republicans right now compared to Democrats. Again, that didn't always used to be the case. There's also a newly formed but sharp political divide over who thinks that vaccines are more dangerous than the diseases they're designed to prevent, with 6 times the endorsement rate of that statement for Republicans compared to Democrats. And there's a similar partisan divide over the belief that it's important for children to get vaccinated. There's also a massive partisan divide over who believes that climate change is a major threat, with about 80% of Democrats believing it and less than a quarter of Republicans. There's also a significant split over whether the recent wildfires in LA had anything to do with climate change, about 47% of Democrats believing yes, only 21% of Republicans saying yes. Motivated reasoning also explains why we can be so hypocritical based on the whims and conveniences of our political parties. So, for example, as soon as Trump won the 2024 election, Republicans' claims about the elections being rigged, or for that matter, complaints about the price of eggs, poof, right? Just disappeared in an instant. As I suggested earlier, while it may be tempting to say that the partisan divide over factual beliefs represents a difference in intellect or education, I don't think that's the best way to understand the divide over these issues. For one thing, as a whole, educational levels aren't actually all that different between Democratic and Republican voters. Not only that, if you look at studies that measure motivated reasoning or conspiratorial thinking, education actually has very little predictive value over those two things. And in fact, there's some evidence that motivated reasoning and conspiratorial thinking are actually more prevalent among the highly educated, especially among white men. Now, liberals and Democrats are hardly immune to false beliefs or conspiracy theories, not by a long shot. But returning to my 3M model, I would argue that the current partisan divide over false beliefs, particularly around scientific issues like vaccines and climate change, like I've been talking about, is best understood in relation to different levels of trust and mistrust in science and scientists. In recent years, Republicans have been 3 times more likely than Democrats to have no confidence that scientists are acting in the best interest of the public. Although conservatives would, of course, disagree, and some might go the both sides route and claim that all politicians lie, it's also really been conservative political leaders that have adopted misinformation and deliberate disinformation as a political strategy in recent years, in support of their own vested interests, whether related to amassing political power or supporting the likes of big oil for financial gain. Just so, the current administration seems intent on removing any barriers to pursuing those self-interests, whether that means pulling the plug on funding for scientific research, putting a halt to vaccine development, promoting scientific denialism under the guise of healthy scientific skepticism, or even any mention of climate change. All the while dismantling the constitutional system of checks and balances in the name of government efficiency, while claiming to be champions of free speech. Hannah Arendt, the late political philosopher and still a leading voice on authoritarianism, tells us that the purpose of eroding truth, the purpose of the whole political purpose of the post-truth world, is to ultimately control and manipulate the masses. So a famous quotation of hers says, "If everyone lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that no one believes anything any longer. And with such a people, you can do what you please." With that understanding, we should bear in mind that those of us who are consumers of disinformation, who are consumers in the disinformation food chain, are victims, although that doesn't absolve us from responsibility. All right, how am I doing in time? I think pretty well. Okay, so we're almost at the end of my talk, and as the title promised, I plan to say a little something about antidotes. So what is it that we can do about false beliefs and the havoc that they're wreaking on the country and the world? So the last chapter in my book offers what I call a prescription for a post-truth world, and offers some suggestions on what we can do as both individuals and society, centered around this 3M model of mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. I also spend considerable time throughout the book covering how we might better engage with our ideological opposites while steering clear of endless confrontation and dispute. And so you can read more about that in my book, but I'll provide a quick, brief synopsis here. So first, on an individual level, we can start by taking an honest look in the mirror and strive to hold our own belief in ways that are mentally healthy, using what I irreverently call the holy trinity of truth detection. So this includes intellectual humility, which is just accepting that we could be wrong; cognitive flexibility, which means that we're able to listen and understand other perspectives and at least have a willingness to possibly change our minds if the evidence warrants it; and analytical thinking, which everyone always thinks just means that you're smart or you took a class in logic. That's not what it's about. Analytical thinking just means slowing down, kind of pumping the brakes, and considering that the information that we encounter might not be true, and especially when we want it to be true, and instead looking at the evidence before we decide to commit to belief. That's been studied and shown to be actually an effective antidote to belief in fake news. Second, on a societal level, I think there are also ways that we can address mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. Number one, getting institutions of authority, like the medical establishment that I belong to regain the trust of the people by being transparent and engaging with the public by giving them a seat at the proverbial table. Number two, overhauling education across the lifespan, not just kids, by teaching people the philosophy of science, meaning not teaching you how to do a science experiment per se, but teaching you why we should listen to science, why it's a good way to attain truth. Teaching analytical thinking, teaching media literacy, in implementing what information scientists called inoculation techniques that use pre-bunking instead of debunking, that prepares people so that when they prepares people to spot misinformation rather than waiting till they've already been exposed to it. In that way, it's actually sort of like a vaccine. And number 3, this is a tough one, but reducing misinformation that's out there through content moderation, by sort of free market principles, doing a better job of marketing the plain old truth to make it more appealing to people, and holding those who disseminate disinformation liable when it causes harm. Okay, now in closing, one thing I don't spend a lot of time talking about in the book, and that I do want to say now, is something that I think has become increasingly important since the stakes changed on November 5th, 2024. Shortly after the election, people were asking me, what do I do now that this new regime is in place? And so I wrote a piece for my blog on Psychology Today. It was actually rejected by the editors because it portrayed the new administration as an autocracy, and it recommended that people participate in political activism, which the editors thought was sort of too partisan and took us too far away from psychology. And so I self-published it on Medium instead. Great cartoon that I'll narrate to those not seeing the slide. So this is a guy in a doctor's office sitting on the exam table, and the doctor says, "Here's your problem. It looks like you're paying attention to what's going on." So I would argue that activism is exactly what we now need to preserve our sanity and to fight back against false beliefs that are killing children, destroying the planet, and putting autocrats and oligarchs in power, and replacing the democratic institutions that have historically made America great. We need to rally around a slogan that isn't rooted in the past but looks to the future. I happen to like the new one from Superman that calls for truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. To achieve truth, justice, and a better tomorrow, we need to stand up for science, we need to stand up for truth, and we need to demand access to evidence-based medical care, sound climate policy, and civil rights for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, etc. To be successful, we need to think about building coalitions, sometimes with people we might not have previously agreed with, and find sort of universal ground. Learn how to engage with our ideological opponents instead of writing them off as incomprehensible others, while focusing on the false beliefs that are being fed to us from apex predators at the top of the disinformation food chain. We need to contact our political leaders. We need to take to the streets. We should boycott Tesla. There's a lot of Tesla owners here in the Bay Area. This one I'm guilty of. We should delete our Facebook and Twitter accounts. I'm working on that one. And some of us need to run for political office rather than just complaining about who's in power all the time, right? The Republicans have done a really, really good job of that. Other democracies turned autocracies around the world have laid out a blueprint for us to follow, and they've warned us to get active now before it's too late. This is in Georgia, right? Not on the east coast of the US, but European Georgia. They've been continuously protesting every day. They go to work, and at the end of the day, they go protest. They've been doing that for over 100 days now. So, in closing, American democracy might very well be ending thanks to false beliefs, but it will surely end if we don't do anything about it. Thank you. All right, I think I'm supposed to grab a mic. Oh, I'm on the microphone.
No, you've got
I'm supposed to sit in the hot seat.
you've got to select people.
Oh, I get to do it?
Yeah.
Well, this gentleman right here.
Great talk. You made an effective argument how cognitive biases in human psychology make us vulnerable to misinformation. I'm wondering if you pull the lens back into deep human history, if our vulnerability to misinformation might not have been a survival mechanism. So speed of decision making around danger, for example, someone says, tiger's in a bush, and it might be wrong, but you'll live. The guy who's debating what the wrestling is might not make it to dinner. Shared narratives, create social cohesion even if they're wrong. And if you're an outlier to that, you could be what's it called, kicked out of the group, and that could be lethal in a hunter-gatherer society. And then there's always been and natural evolution to follow strong leaders. So, but even if they're wrong, they create social order and structure, which keeps people alive. So there's been a reason why we've been vulnerable to it, and we've spent more of our time in deep human history than in civilized society. I wonder how that might inform mechanisms for protecting us today when it's become a bug, not a feature.
Great question. Long one, so I'll have to keep it. It's okay. Couple of things come to mind. I think somewhere in the book I make a comparison to the disinformation food chain and eating food, right? And the idea that we arguably have sort of a junk food diet, not only in terms of food, but also in information. And so there's a similar argument that says that, evolutionarily we have developed in this certain way, but evolution didn't prepare us for, Chips Ahoy chocolate chips and Doritos, like the vast amount of junk food that we have out there. So I think you can make a similar argument with misinformation, that yes, there's some parts of it that are evolutionarily favored, but that didn't, there was no way to see this sort of unprecedented level of misinformation. In my own lifetime experience, I often talk about how, I'm sure I mentioned this in the book, when I was a kid, or probably up until college, we all have had the experience of going into the grocery store checkout line, right? And that's where we see things like that Hillary Clinton is actually a robot, except we recognize that for what it is. Most of us recognize that for what it is, right? That's where the tabloid journalism is. But now that kind of information isn't relegated to the grocery store checkout line. It's all the way out there. And like I said in the talk, it's right beside legitimate forms of information. So some people ask me, well, how are we supposed to tell them apart? I mean, it's really difficult, especially when that misinformation is designed to look like reliable information. Like I said, there's claims that there's scientific papers claiming X, Y, Z, and then you go look and you're like, wait a minute, like this isn't peer reviewed, this isn't a scientific journal, like, all these kinds of things. So I hope that sort of indirectly answers your question. I think another thing I'll say is, early on in the book, I talk about the concept of heuristics, which is sort of a Daniel Kahneman, idea that we have this fast thinking and slow thinking. Many of you have probably read Kahneman's book by that same title. And so he talks about process one and process two thinking. Process one is sort of intuitive, right? I look at something, I see a rattlesnake, and I instinctively run, because as you say, evolutionarily, probably you should do that if you see a rattlesnake. But then there's this process two thinking that has a slow down and say, is that a rattlesnake or is that a fake thing? And am I getting, what's that term, punked? Like somebody is, whatever. So I think what I tried to make a case for in the book is to achieve balance, right? It's not that we've all become type 2 thinkers or process 2 thinkers, and it's a balance. And same is true of things like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. There's a whole chapter on positive illusions. Like I said early on, this idea that we tend to overall tell ourselves lies that make us feel better. Like that I'm an awesome speaker, or I'm great looking, or that, I'm going to win the lottery. That has a positive effect on mental health. But I think there's also plenty of examples like the ones I brought up where that's not the case. So hopefully that answers your question.
I'm going to add one thing here, which is we have on the website for this talk, there's a section on detecting false information. So that's a good reference, including Bergstrom and West's book, Calling Bull the Art of Skepticism. So we do have.
Yeah, let me follow up on that, because I didn't mean to say, I sort of shrugged my shoulders. I didn't mean to say that it's impossible to tell good information from not. But going back to my model about trust, a lot of us make that decision based on just trusted sources of information. And I don't think that's ideal. That's not necessarily the best way to do it. I think it is good to digest different sources of information. I read conservative media, Oftentimes on election night, I will watch Fox News purposely, just to kind of see a different perspective. So I think that's important. We shouldn't just be stuck with one trusted source of information. But back, like I said at the end of the talk, we also have to have a little bit of an activist mentality, and we have to demand that the news services out there are giving us high quality information. So maybe it does mean that you should cancel your Washington Post subscription, for example, if it's gone in a different direction. So I think there are ways to do it. I'm just saying it's tricky. I think this woman with the mask. Yes.
Yeah, you're a doctor. You're an MD. Oh, and my question really goes to the physiology of the brain, because in the matter of religion and so forth, people, why do they believe the way they believe? There was some ideas about that had to do more with the physiology of the brain. Now, you talked about the things that are out there that are causing us to feel better, and that was all very valuable. Thank you. But what about this idea of what part of the brain causes people, because with all these explanations, there are still a lot of people, no matter what you do and how you analyze it, they still believe the way they believe. What about that?
Yeah, good question. I guess my response is a couple things. One is, I think I make this point somewhere in the book, that there's kind of a running joke in medicine or in psychiatry that if we're studying what seems to be a psychiatric disorder and we then figure out what's causing it on a molecular or brain anatomical level, then it no longer becomes a psychiatric illness, right? Then we hand it over to neurology. So part of what psychiatry involves is not knowing. I went to MIT. I was studying to be a molecular biologist. I studied DNA and these kind of things. I was very much mechanistically oriented. But I hate talking about mechanisms in psychiatry because the bottom line is we don't know. So part of the point of my book is to try to explain belief and behavior and that relationship, but none of it talks about regions of the brains. And every time I hear stuff about that, I'm like, look, give us 100 years and maybe we'll start working some of that out. So I don't think we're at that point, but I would encourage you to resist the temptation. I had a slide that I flashed up quickly. You often will see a news headline that says something like, neuroscientist finds out what's wrong with Trump supporters' brains. Just not where the money is, right? These are, again, shared vulnerabilities that we all have. I would encourage us to get away from the belief that conservatives' brains are, messed up or something, and that's the problem. So I always say that I don't think we're going to find the answer to what you're asking in my career lifetime, or probably not my biological lifetime, but hopefully one day we'll get there. Over here.
Thank you. I had a question about, so over the last 10 years, what I've noticed is that much of the conspiracy theories that some people tend to believe are more geared towards convenience and laziness. So it's easier to not get a vaccine than to get one. It's easier to go out and party than to stay home and socially distance, right? It's easier to believe that immigrants are taking jobs as opposed to we need to retrain our workforce to be more relevant. So that, alongside the reluctance I think many of us have, and it's just hard in general to change our behavior and our consumption habits. How does that, or what proportion of kind of what we see do you think is attributed to essentially laziness and a reluctance to want to change and maybe fear around change?
Yeah, when I mentioned analytical thinking, as I said, analytical thinking isn't being smart. What it is slowing down and saying maybe this information that I'm seeing isn't. So in a way, that's sort of the opposite of what you're describing, right? There is an ease where we can easily fall into misinformation. And what we want to do when that happens, it always happens. What we want to do to prevent that from happening is to slow down and say, well, maybe this information isn't correct. If you look at research on conspiracy theories, there's this whole laundry list of psychological quirks or needs that are associated with a greater propensity to believe in conspiracy theories. One is what I've often called the 3 C's: control, certainty, and closure. So that's kind of what you're saying. There's an idea that conspiracy theories, if you take something like the assassination of JFK or the death of Princess Diana, like terrible occurrences that were national traumas, and one explanation is shit happens, sorry, right? That's sort of terrifying. But another is, no, this was a plot by the da-da-da. So there's an idea that those kind of narratives in a way are easy, but they often that they offer a sort of narrative that's wrapped up in a tiny bow and therefore are acceptable. What that research also finds, though, unsurprisingly, is that it doesn't actually satisfy the need for the reassuring explanation, right? Because there's nothing really reassuring that there's a conspiracy going on. So they're not actually serving the purpose that for some people they might be using them for. Yeah. And sometimes I don't do a good job of seeing people's hands raised. So if I've missed you, just stand up and wave both hands.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have 2 questions. One's very brief, and they're kind of related. So I am a psychologist in training, and when I think of like delusions or psychosis, like one thing that my mind immediately goes to is paranoia. And like with misinformation, it like I was even getting paranoid just like in the talk. So thank you. But I guess my question is, like, from a psychiatric point of view, what do you think, like, in talking about social justice, what do you think, like, do you think of regulating your nervous system before reading the news or approaching information in general as an act of social justice outside of just reading and looking for the right information? And then with that, I was wondering if you have any recommendations for more non-biased news sources that you either listen to via podcasts or like read, because both sides, like liberal and conservative, drive me nuts.
Yeah. Another great question. Let's see. Trying to remember the first part. What was the first part of the question?
Regulating your nervous system.
Yeah. So, I mean, you might want to look for that piece I wrote for Medium about whatever it was, preserving your sanity with a looming autocracy. I mean, it is tough. I certainly don't support doom scrolling, right? For those of you from my generation, that sort of means endlessly just, looking at the news, and it's a really easy way to get, quote unquote, depressed or distraught. At the same time, I think it's also really important to keep informed. And so, as I was saying to this question, it's sort of about what dose is right for you, where you're not going to spiral into a depression. And, I just talked to a patient today who said, I have no intention to ever have kids or get married or have a life because, like, the world is, effed up kind of thing. So I'm not suggesting that you should take it to that level, but I do think we should be informed. As to the question of the objective information, I struggle with that one. My own style, if, for example, I'm trying to answer a medical question, should I start this person on which antihypertensive agent? I tend to be kind of old school, right? And in medicine, there's this thing called PubMed, which is a search engine for articles. And I'll do that, and I'm kind of obsessive also. So I'll go find sometimes 20, 30 articles, and I'll read every single one and highlight them, and then I'll say, okay, I think I have a good answer. So in a way, that's what I'm suggesting you should do. I used to subscribe, not endorsing this per se, but this thing called The Week, which is a sort of fluffy, superficial treatment of things, but it draws from a million different sources. And so if it's talking about the address to the joint session last week, it'll say, well, the National Review thought this was awesome, but the New Republic said it was a travesty. I really like that because, like I said with PubMed, it allows me to then look up the source material and say, well, I'm going to go read that article. So I like that. I canceled my prescription because it was pretty expensive. So I think that's part of it. And I do think that, unfortunately, the media landscape has changed. I've even seen this in, don't want to call out the people paying my bills. I've seen that in the sponsors of my blog, where there's this shift towards, like, make it shorter, make it, bullet points. And I'm like, no, like, that's not what it's about. So I think that's the tough part. I really like long-form journalism. Like, I subscribe to The Atlantic. There was an article about how that's the worst magazine in the world, which I thought was an interesting argument. But I like that. The problem is we don't really have time for that. And meanwhile, we're all, we get 50 things in front of our face. So I think the solution is to try to just slow down, be more careful, but it's hard to also keep up. Let me make sure I didn't miss any hands. Okay, back there.
I know you said that there's not a physiological explanation, but looking at your charts and X% believe these weird beliefs, has there been other studies of those 50 of those percent as to what their diet is, what chemicals they're consuming? Seriously, it is because there can be causations between what we do to ourselves physically and what happens to our brain.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I kind of goes back to what I said earlier, which is, I mean, there's no doubt that, in psychiatry, we've been talking about this for decades, right? Is it nature or nurture? Is it something inherent to your own physiology, or is it the experiences that you've accrued over a lifetime? And the answer, of course, is both, right? So I wouldn't think one way or another. But going back to what I was saying before, when we talk about environment, the nature, no, that would be the nurture part of it. The nurture part of it, I mean, it's an interesting question about diet and that kind of thing. I'm not discounting it, but I'm not aware of any research that has looked into that. And to take it back to the point I was making, I think it's the informational diet that is most predictive. When I talk about conspiracy theories, I always say I don't like the term conspiracy theorist, because generally we're not talking about, despite the stereotype, somebody who's down in their mother's basement and connecting the dots and got the bulletin board and the yarn and the string. They're just going online and they're finding stuff like, oh, look, the Earth is flat, right? So it's not really about theorizing. It's just about, I have this idea, right? I'm just asking questions. I'm looking for answers. I'm doing my own research. And you go, I like that idea. I think that is the thing that's most predictive of these beliefs, is where you go for your information. Usually, when people start bringing up something like, vaccines cause autism, I mean, I know that argument. I know what it's based on. And then sure enough, people start, bringing that kind of stuff up. So that, I think, is more predictive. I'm not going to say that, the other factors aren't worth pursuing as well. But I think it's mostly just about what we read and who we trust for information.
One more question.
I guess you got it.
Great. Well, to end the talk, I know the name of your book is is False. So my question is about truth, and many of these ideas, of course, and many ideas are based on twists of true things, right? I mean, most conspiracy theories have some nuggets of truth that they've just either been misinterpreted or pieced together in a false way or something like that. So I guess I know I'm thinking about your three pathways to enlightenment. And one of them was basically inquiry, right? But what would you say about how to get it sifting through that? Because it is hard to understand sometimes, because especially for things that are either technical or you're not aware of, there are things that are true, and yet there can be great falsehoods drawn from those conclusions, or conclusions drawn from that are false.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the title to my book gets credit to my agent over there, Bonnie. So brilliant. But yeah, the first thing my mother asked me was, shouldn't it be called Truth? So that's funny. Let's see. Sorry, now I blanked on the end of your question. It had to do with...
Well, just that even conspiracy theories are based, there's usually some truth in there. Right?
Yeah.
So kind of helping from your research, from your thoughts, how should we approach that? I guess that's my question.
Well, I mean, part of the reason I make a big deal about mistrust is, if we're going to go from false to true, it's about trust. Like when I haven't given this talk in Texas. Maybe I will someday. And when that happens, I expect more people to raise their hands and start saying, I want to argue about this point. I typically avoid doing that. in part because I'm not an expert in climate change. So the reality is we do have to trust certain sorts of information. You know, in the book, I talk about my college roommate who won a Nobel Prize in physics. And he talks about how people, in fact, he just emailed me yesterday. He talks about people are constantly emailing him saying, I have the real theory of the universe and you're wrong, and this kind of thing. So every time I get something like that, I'll turn to one of my expert friends and I'll say, does this make sense? So we do actually have to rely on people who know better than us. You know, most of us who are even quote unquote experts are experts in this one tiny little thing, right? Somebody who's a Nobel Prize winner in physics might not know anything about auto mechanics, you know, for example. So much of our knowledge does require that we trust informational sources. Just unfortunately, sometimes we get that wrong.
Okay, seeing as I've tangled up my headset. Thank you, Dr. Pierre. We're grateful that you were able to be with us today. We're also grateful to our audience here, as well as those listening to the recording. And remember, everybody, look at the club's webpage for this talk to see a curated list of useful references about false beliefs. And now, this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, commemorating its 122nd year of enlightened discussion, is adjourned.